Good morning, everyone.
Good morning to you.
How are you? They are
I'm
good.
fine. I'm fine, doctor. How are you this morning?
Yeah. May I ask Moses to come and give us a word of prayer?
Let's pray. Oh God, we thank you for this moment that we are here for this defense. We thank you for all that you bring this moment, and we pray that from now on you'll carry us forward with great understanding, all from you. We pray.
Thank you very much, Moses, for the prayer. I'm happy that we are here for Sophie's defense. When I woke up this morning, I prayed for you, and I recalled a song which we used to sing in secondary days, that this is the day the Lord has made. And I'm pretty sure that today is going to be the end of the many times during which I asked, where is my book? To the extent that sometimes whenever when you hear my voice or my footsteps, then you would close the office so that I don't have to ask. But I'm happy my asking and reminding you of my book. It has brought us this far. Sophie will be speaking to us on his on her thesis titled Imaging the Urban in Uganda's Written Poetry Anthologies between 1960 to 2020. And I'll give you 40 minutes to speak to us. Today I'm very generous, 40 minutes. If you can use 30, the better. After that, we shall have the critical reader, opponent, divorce advocate to speak to us for an hour. But if you can use 40, even 30 minutes, that would be great. After his interaction with the candidate, I'll invite the rest of the panelists to speak to us, apart from one professor who will.
Thank you so very much, Chair, for giving me this opportunity. And good morning all here present and those online for making the time. My name is Lakot, Sophie, and I have been and still in the loving hands of Dr. Susan Kiguli and Dr. Benge OKot. The title of my thesis is Imaging the Urban in Uganda's Written Poetry Anthologies between 1960s to 2020. This is the outline I'm going to use to speak to you about Ugandan poetry and Ugandan urban. To begin with, the motivation. For me, I was born and raised in a small village of Paicho in Gulu district before I moved into Gulu town, now Gulu city, and a fast growing city. My experience when I was young with my relatives who used to live in the city of Kampala then was that we would meet only during family gatherings such as marriage, funeral, or when they bring their newborn babies to the family in the village. And when they would come to the village, they carry along with them items such as clothes, glass plates, sugar, and other things. And while they are returning to Kampala, they would also carry with them fresh foods such as cassava, sim paste that they made us grind for them, and including herbal medicine. Then I didn't really quite understand, but I realized now that when they were going to us to the rural there in Paicho, they were actually carrying the urban into the rural. And while returning with those, sim paste and so on, they were carrying along with them the rural into the urban, a kind of interaction between the rural and the urban. And so interacting with these two texts, Bill Friend's The African City, A History, and The Process of Urbanization in Africa by Catherine Cogre, in which these scholars argue, especially in line with the East African city, that people within East African cities settle around their ethnic groups, and that they do maintain their rural homes. And the reason they give, among other things, is to take their loved ones to be buried at home. And also, when they retire, they go to their rural homes to live there for retirement and for other cultural purposes. I saw this argument as speaking to my earlier, experience of the interaction between the rural kin and then the urban kin. This is what motivated this study. Adam Jennifer, in her text, Theorizing a Sense of Place in a Transnational Community, suggests use of art creations such as storytelling, music, photographs, and poetry to be used by those who are interested in studying poetry, because these are things that allows reflection on the city. And I decided to use poetry. I chose poetry because of the ways in which it uses language. Poetry uses language in a very compressed, terse, and evocative manner. And poetry uses words, images, and sound to capture meaning, acting like an X-ray mechanism to reveal the very obvious or ordinary, subtle or hidden lived experience in a particular place. And I draw my poems from poetry anthology. Poetry anthologies draw together multiple voices, which allows contestation, convergence, and collections of thoughts in a particular, publications or on a particular issues being, written. And then the expression imaging the urban that I have in my title means the ways in which poets portray, depict, or show urban life in their poems. I choose to work between 1960 to 2020 1960s is a very important moment in Ugandan history. First, it is the birth of the nation, the 1962 independence. But most importantly for me is the fact that in 1962, Kampala got its city status in March 1962. Before that, it was having a municipal status from 1947 to 1962. So I thought I could start my work from this time. And also in literary, landscape, this is the time when poetry, alongside the other genres, became more visible in the Ugandan literary landscape. And the 2000s saw an influx of poetry production in large numbers, both individual collections and also poetry anthologies being produced. And I end my selection in 2020 because in 2020, a number of publications also came up. For example, the Kitara Poetry Nation series that was really published in large number. And when I surveyed the text, I saw that there were issues to do with urbanity in it. So I decided to stop my selection in 2020. In terms of the background, what is an African city? A unique African city existed before any external influence became explicit. But as time goes on, due to trade system in the world, such as the Mediterranean and the transatlantic trade system, the African city evolved. And further, with the coming of the colonialism, the African city even evolved further, becoming a colonial constructed city. And even today, with the technological growth, the African city is striving to become a techno city. Many African states are trying to look out for how they can make African city a smart city. This development, scholars look at the African city differently. Rathbone and Anderson, for example, estimates that by 2030, more of Africa's people would live in the city than in the rural. And they see that the fastest growing region in Africa is East Africa. An estimation that rhymes with what Goodfellow says, by 2100, no less than 5 of the top largest cities in the world will come from East Africa. Very intriguing, because none is even in the top 70 today, but this is approximation that scholars are making. Uganda, for example, has majority of her population in the rural, but with significant growth of urban centers, plus also the creation of new regional cities today. Uganda, in a way, is promoting urban life. Literary studies on African cities and the general scholarship on African cities have concentrated mainly on Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, Kinshasa, and Johannesburg. These are cities that are highly developed. They have attracted fiction on them, and also these fictions have attracted critical attention to them. In Uganda, we also have scholars who respond to, in terms of fiction, who respond to urban life. For example, OKot Pabitek's novel, Lakot, published way back in 1953, construct urban life. Enrico Siruma's short story, 1988, and then Abyssinian Chronicle by Moses Isegawas, and Arthur Gakwandi's Kosea Chifefe, 2002, all do construct urban life in Uganda. But some of these texts are mainly picked, especially for Arthur Gakwandi, and then Abyssinian Chronicle, they are picked and read within the post-colonial crisis and not the urban narrative. in them. Therefore, scholars have observed generally that critical attention to poetry in Uganda does not match the production, and this is the same phenomenon for Africa. Therefore, this study is driven by a particular interest in reading the urban within the wealth of associations poetic forms evoke. I join urban studies from this angle. What is the matter in this study? The matter is that whereas urbanity is increasingly being promoted in Uganda, given the launch of new cities, for example, there appears to be dearth of scholarly works on people's perception about urbanity, especially from a poetic angle. And a study of creative work focusing on poetry as a case study will reflect on larger questions surrounding evolving urban spatiality in Uganda. The study therefore explores how poets creatively imagine and articulate nuances which mirror Ugandan urbanity. My general objective in this study is to investigate how Ugandan written poetry anthologies between 1960 to 2020 image the urban. And specifically, I set out to investigate the idea of urban dynamics in terms of context and people's identities as it emerges from the selected poems, and to interrogate the notion of self and community in urban space as they come from the poems, to examine poetic constructions of the notions of rural-urban interaction in the selected poems. Finally, to analyze the portrayal of changing urban realities of Uganda in the selected poems. This study is anchored on three theories. The first is planetary urbanism, which views the urban as a fabric that stretches and envelopes everywhere. The proponent here argues that the urban is borderless, boundless, and shapeless, and that we do not even know where the border actually starts and stops. Within this theorization, I work with Emin and Thrift's cities reimaging the urban, in which they postulate key metaphors of reading the urban. These metaphors include the rhythm of the city, which focuses on the repetitive and recurrent actions within the urban space, those things that register the daily tempo of the city, such as movement of cars, noise, sounds, and so on. And then the second metaphor that I use from Emin and Thrift is transitivity, which suggests urban is porous and that it has its footprints elsewhere, including the past. And these metaphors help me to think through what the representation of the dynamics of the urban life is and the connection between the urban and the rural, respectively. The second theory that I employ is the notion of the African self, postulated by Augustine Nue, where Nue says that the African self exists and relates with multiple entities, exerting itself into the political, into the social, even the cultural. And in his work, Remapping the Fabric of the African Self, he identifies 8 different manifestations of the African self. And 3 of those I saw applicable for my reading of the poems. They are the generative self, which is the self that longs for achievements and successes. And then the relational self, this is the communal self, a self that thrives at being with others. And the transcendental self, the spiritual self, self that focuses on the inner relations with the Creator. These different manifestations I used to think through notions of self and community. And some of this really emerges in the way personas and characters in the poem negotiate their life within the urban space. The third theoretical lens that I use is New Historicism. New Historicism is encourages literary criticism to be based on parallel reading of literary and non-literary texts because they are part of a network. And particularly, I pay attention on the argument that history and literature are inseparable, and that history influences art, and also art influences history. And the fact that art participates in constructing and consolidating power discourses and identities. In terms of methodology, I used interpretive design, which focuses on the use of language in interpreting a given context within the qualitative approach. And the method of data collection that I used is document review and close reading. And then finally, I carry out data analysis using textual analysis to interrogate the different poems. Key findings. In my objective 1, I focused on urban dynamics, looking at context and identities. And the tenets that I employ here is the metaphor of the rhythm of the city. And in this objective, I focused on the use of context. And 3 major contexts emerged from the reading. That is the street, the market, and the taxi parks. I considered these contexts as noodle points upon which multiple urban issues emerged. And this context, the readings reveal, are foregrounded through use of metaphors, symbols, strong images, and parallelism, among others. For example, there is a poem here by Timothy Wangusa. I would like to read for you and then talk about it. The poem goes, The Portrait. Lunchtime break and motor cars, dashing, braking, stalling, starting, dashing, cutting corners, raising the dust, dashing to catch food and beat time at 2 o'clock. Beyond all this, his head between palm of his hands, eyes closed, the stomach talking, to his head sits the man with the broom, waiting for another session of sweeping at 2 o'clock. A poem by Timothy Wangusa. This poem constructs an urban street at lunchtime, and it creates, like the title suggests, it creates 2 portraits of an urban street at this time. The first portrait that they give us is of a busy street characterized by motor cars, and then the dashing, the braking, the stalling. This is a use of parallel structures, repetition of the same grammatical patterns, starting, dashing, cutting corners, to create the picture of a busy street characterized by this. The second portrait is of in another corner of the street. There is a portrait of a man, here sitting. His stomach is having a dialogue with the head here, and then he has his broom waiting for another session of sweeping. Both these portraits are controlled by the notion of time here. Both the busy people in the street running to catch food are also being controlled here. At 2 o'clock, both these parties are going to resume their work. This man going to resume the sweeping. This one, perhaps they're going to resume their work in the office. What is special about this poem is the use of images here, strong images that come out. There are two distinct images in these two portraits. The first, busy wrote, and then the second one, a state of inertia, a state of inactivity is going on here, nothing. But what is only going on here is the fact that this man is having a dialogue and also waiting. There are two status symbols that comes out very clearly here. The motor cars associated with the affluence or the wealthy, and then there is the image of the broom here associated with this man to depict the class in which he belongs. I argue that these two portraits presents the social class differences in the urban space. But most importantly, the urban, by the fact that there is so much life here, lunchtime break, motor cars, dashing, braking, there is so much activity, liveliness in this part. I argue that the urban promotes machine life and then dehumanizes the disadvantaged. In my objective 2, that focuses on notions of self and community, I use the tenets of the notion of self, such as the generative self manifestation, and focused on use of symbolism. And I talk about people as symbols of communities. The readings in this chapter indicates that self and community are complex and multi-layered. Poets do emphasize the complex social interaction and suggest people as key in defining a space, but not the architecture or the built form. There are many communities that emerged from the reading within the urban space, and these communities, such as the slum, sex workers, Christian believers, do depend on each other for their continued existence. And also I noted that both individual and communities within urban space do struggle to survive. Then thirdly, in terms of rural-urban interaction, I employed the metaphor of transitivity. I go back to Eminent Thrift's notion of the urban being a place of intermingling and focused on focused on themes, that is values and practices, family connections, and other themes that came up. In this chapter, there are poems that resonate with the idea of the city being a place of intermingling. And then there are also poems that show conflict and disconnection at the same time. They use metaphors such as metaphors of marriage to depict this rural-urban interaction. But at the same time, they show that there are points that the relationship is quite restrictive and a bit subtle. That is why I conclude that in as far as rural-urban interaction is concerned, it presents a somewhat paradoxical, situation. Finally, under my objective 4, I looked at changing urban portrayal of Uganda in the selected poems. And I focused on new historicism with the use of foregrounding, that is, looking at how specific images, make ideas depicted at a particular time stand out, and that which resonates with what is going on in the country generally. And here I focused on use of images. In general, I noted that from 1960s to 2020, there has been significant change in the way urban life is portrayed. And poets embrace this development with both critical and nostalgic tone. Generally, the poems constructed in the 1960s present two characters of Kampala, projecting the idea of inequality. And then poems constructed in the 1970s through to 90s, there are more overt representation of urban life coming through images such as the market, the motorcars, and so on. While the year 2000 to 2020, there are natural images of hills, valleys, and the impalas, as well as the swamp. These natural images, poets construct as the beauty or the aesthetic quality of what Kampala is. As for the hill, for example, is an identity marker of the city of Kampala. More contemporary poems give identity markers of Kampala as Boda Boda and Rolex. In fact, poets think that urban life in Uganda, or Kampala as such, is becoming a Boda Boda city. There is a poem titled Kampala, and then the persona is having a ride within the city, moving through a pothole places and then a more fine place. And then the persona sips the soda from behind them, okay, the rider, and exclaim, "Oh, this feels like Kampala's a Boda Boda city. This is a Boda Boda city," she asserts. So poets think of the city of Kampala as a Boda Boda city, a new identity marker that is coming up. And also, poets think Kampala's identity rests in the ordinary food, that is the Rolex snack. There is a poem, a beautiful poem titled Rolled Eggs. And in this poem, the persona is searching for the truth or for the knowledge of what Kampala is. And he goes on, is the knowledge of Kampala in the headlines, newspapers' headlines? Is it in the story of land grabbing? Is it in the story of the tycoon, okay, spending their money and so on? And he says no. And he reprimands us, the readers, that stop that unwarranted search of yours. I have unearthed where the knowledge, the taste of Kampala lies. It is not in your silver watch, but it is in the Wandegear Rolex. So Kampala is something that we can taste and consume. Okay. This becomes her identity, her new identity marker. So those are the two, identity markers that have come besides the hill, which is prominently associated with what Kampala is from the history. I therefore conclude that the city is not a coherent space, and there is an overriding quest for survival. The interaction of self is often engendered by other factors such as social status. And then the interaction between the rural and the urban is paradoxical, revealing the ambivalences that underlie the relationship. There is consistent and gradual change in the portrait of urbanity, which resonates with growth patterns of Uganda. I therefore recommend that policymakers pay attention to how identity markers of Kampala, such as Boda Boda and Rolex, shape the culture and the organization of the people in the urban space. Secondly, National Curriculum Development Center should consider a systematic inclusion of anthologies in the curriculum because of the diverse and multiple voices in them. In as far as areas for further research is concerned, I suggest that gender relationships in Ugandan poetry be further explored, because in my reading there were a number of issues emerging, but the scope couldn't allow me get to it in depth. And then anthologies do offer diverse voices, and I recommend specific and deliberate study of poetry anthologies as far as theme of urbanity is concerned, or any other theme that someone can come up with, because this is a rich archive. In terms of contribution, this study demonstrates that poetry anthologies is a rich archive, and poetry is a worthwhile lens for viewing urbanity. The study brings a literary perspective which has not been strongly visible into the debate of how to negotiate the urban and what the urban offers. Finally, the study expands on the ideas of the ways of looking at the urban as being porous, something that has evolved even over time. These are my publications that I got. I got two. One I did alone, and it is published in the Makerere Journal of Languages, Literature and Communication. And then the second one came through in Social Dynamics, and I did that with my supervisors. The third one is a work in progress that is heading for a book chapter in the Literary Cities. Thank you. Mwebale nnyo. Asante sana. Afoyo Matek Winya.
Sorry, I didn't know that the mic is not on. Thank you very much, Sophie, for that beautiful presentation. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to recognize the presence of our principal, Professor Helen Nkabala. Say hi to us, Prof. I know you are online. Hello? I think she has stepped out. Now I invite the critical reader, Dr. Ronald Musanje, to interact with the candidate. You are very welcome, Ronald, once again.
Professor Saudan Namiaro, the academics present, our dear candidate, and members of the scholarly community and the public. It's a great honor for me to be here again on yet another Viva like this, or public defense like this. And I'm always greatly humbled to be here in an institution that nurtured me, and more so to do this work before scholars from whose hands I have been mentored. I'm very, very humbled. To our candidate, I want to first of all congratulate you for reaching this step. It's a very memorable day in your life. I think one that you will not forget for time to come. A public defense is always a moment of anxiety, but I want you to relax, and as I go through this work and this exercise, and we come to more understanding of imaging the urban in Uganda's poetry anthologies 1960 to 2020. I'd also like to congratulate the supervisors also for the work well done. It's a long journey for a PhD, but they have accomplished this. So I want to open this with an opening statement about your work, general evaluation about your work. I will not repeat much of what you have said in the interest of time. So your thesis, Imaging the Urban in Uganda's Written Poetry Anthology, attempts to contribute to existing scholarship on literary urbanities by engaging with how Ugandan poets engage with the urban in terms of space, contexts, people, and their relationship beyond the city's boundaries. And I would like to thank you for taking such a bold step and for swimming in these uncharted waters. Candidate Lakot argues that the selected Ugandan poetry draws together a diversity of voices and a collection of perceptions that depict the convergences, disconnections, and an overview of poetic thought and creativity as far as the urban is concerned. The candidate contends that earlier scholarship on Ugandan literary urbanities often cast the urban as a bounded space that was isolated from the rural and the hinterland. The thesis illuminates how specific contexts bring to the foreground dynamics of urban space in selected anthologized Ugandan poems. The candidate richly illustrates how these contexts that the poets use can inform their depiction of physical and social dimensions of the urban space, and how in turn these contexts are vital to our comprehension of everyday realities in these urban spaces. To this end, Lakot uses the context of the market, the street, the tax park to show how the spaces of encounter that compel people to behave in a certain way, showing how the street can be read as a heterogeneous space full of contradictions which are suggestive of deep complexities of the urban space. The thesis demonstrates how the selected Ugandan poems illuminate how the urban street produces multiple images of the city that depict the contradictions and complexities of the relationship within urban space. Lakot's reading of the urban street is profound because it seeks to challenge a mean and thrift's theorization of the urban as a space that is constantly regulated by authorities. However, Lakot is of the view that the infrastructure of the city and the daily activities of people enable the ordinary people to negotiate their visibility and emotional needs. And I wondered how the right to the city would come into this discussion. Contrary to the view that the self is relational and has been connected to various aspects of life, Lakot, though, does not dispute the relationality or the relational aspect of selfhood. However, she views it as an ever-shifting one in accordance with the space and context of the individual's activities and conditions. In line with this view, Lakot reads a selection of Ugandan poetry to demonstrate how the use of figurative language can foreground the poet's construction of self and urban community. Specifically, Lakot shows how various categories of urban people, such as prostitutes, scholars, and slum dwellers, and many others, can be symbols of particular communities in the cityscape. Lakot interests herself in the question, to quote, how do poets perceive and construct the notion of the self and community in the urban space? Lakot sees the value of poetic aesthetics such as figuration, metaphors, and language as vital for illuminating the diverse facets and perceptions that Ugandan poets envis in regards to the concept of the self and community. Lakot's reading of Ugandan poetry anthologies teases out the idea that people understand the city in their way and that there is no uniform or universalized understanding of the urban. Much as the thesis has its strengths, it's not without its challenges though. Normally in the introduction of a thesis, a clear and specific argument is given, and I think, however, the candidate provides a string of arguments that leave the reader baffled about what her exact thesis is. And later on, I'll take you on this issue of what your thesis is. The opening paragraph of the thesis seems forced on the second, and the transition is not clear. The candidate's topic states that it is imaging the urban in Ugandan written poetry anthologies. However, the candidate focuses on Kampala and fails to adequately justify why she focuses on only one city in the country, and yet there are other cities as well and other urban centers in the country. And the question that definitely I'll engage later on with the candidate: does Kampala adequately represent the entire Ugandan urban experience? If so, the candidate should not shy away from stating it clearly. The reason why anthologies are selected for study rather than individual poetry collection is shaky. To quote the candidate, anthologies are chosen here not just as sites from which poems are collected, but also based on the ways in which anthologies are produced, which influences the selection of the poems and organization. Can this be reason enough for excluding non-anthologized poems? The candidate does well to explain her conceptualization of an anthology and extends it to poems in magazines. However, there is no clear conceptualization of Ugandan poetry in the introduction. What is Ugandan poetry? What are the criteria of inclusion and exclusion? Here, Peter Nazareth, Danson Kayana, and Austin Bukenya's conceptualization of Ugandan literature would have been useful. The candidate states that her thesis focuses on Kampala. However, only a paragraph about Kampala is given the background, and yet this city remains the center of her focus. As regards the literature review, the candidate's exploration of literature is comprehensive because it highlights and acknowledges seminal and recent scholarly contributions in the area of urbanity in Africa and the world, and I would like to applaud the candidate for this. Her reading is very comprehensive. She gives, she mentions prominent scholars, seminal scholars, the Boek, Plessat, Meyers, Robinson, and Ogudi, and of course this helps her to foreground her study in existing scholarship. However, the review at times shies away from putting these scholars into dialogue with each other. It is in the conclusion of the review on page 33 that the candidate attempts to highlight the differences among the scholars. The questions that linger with this review are: what are the points of convergency and divergency among the scholars? What is the candidate's view on these debates? The candidate remains unclear about the gap that scholars leave, except on page 22, where the candidate mentions the gaps that are left in Barbara Clarence's reading of Ellen Hellman's text, Ruyad. The rest of the review does not amplify sufficiently some of these gaps in the scholarship. Much as this review draws its analysis from the field of urban geographies, there is, of course, a negligible input from literary urbanities. I would like to congratulate the candidate for her contribution to the study of literary urbanities in Ugandan poetry and for studying our own anthologies and scholars. And candidate Lakot, I would like to take you on a few questions that have arisen from my reading. The first question that I would like to engage with you is a simple one from your topic, or from what you have selected. You state that most of the poems you use are from Kampala or about Kampala. Is that so? And I'm going to ask you, in what sense can you claim that you are imagining the urban in Ugandan poetry anthologies? What would change if your topic would be imaging Kampala in Ugandan poetry anthologies? What difference would it make? Because much of the poems you say are from Kampala, and Kampala becomes almost synonymous with the rest of the country. What voices do you bring from outside Kampala, from other urban centers? Because there are other poems that focus on ginger that are written, the ginger of the 70s and the 80s. And those poems remain silent and not touched on in your work.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for giving me this opportunity and the reading. What would change if I used Kampala instead of the urban? The poems that I engaged with do construct mainly Kampala, but there are also poems that do construct general urban life without necessarily contextualizing Kampala as the basis of their construction. So I thought focusing on Kampala would limit my interrogation of what urban life in Uganda is, because there are poems like that speak about Kampala, and then, you know, Kasese. There are poems like Fare Thee Well, Kampala. This poem just constructs something about Kampala and also takes us outside of Kampala. And then there are some poems Speaking about, for example, the communities of sex workers, they do not mention Kampala at all, but my impression, given the images and what is taking place, for example, in the 1970s, I saw that this contextualization was within urban centers, not named. And therefore, I thought that it would be proper for me to talk about imaging the urban while I front the largest urban center in Uganda. So Kampala, speaking about, Kampala is representative enough to make a generalization that this is how urbanity in Kampala, in Uganda is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You say it's justifiable enough because much of the poems were, of course, written in Kampala and, of course, focus on the city. And, of course, this comes from your page 1 where you state clearly that you have specific focus on Kampala. And indeed, much of these poems, indirectly, you feel, you sense that they are, of course, focusing on the interaction between Kampala and the hinterland, or the Kampala and the country. So thank you for answering that question clearly, or clarifying on that question. From this introduction of your work, can you pinpoint for me the central thesis of your thesis?
From the introduction?
Yeah.
From the introduction, my thesis is that the city is porous and fluid, and that the interaction in the city sometimes present somewhat, ambivalences. From the introduction.
So that is the thesis.
From the introduction.
From the introduction. Okay. What comes out of the reading is, of course, the idea of the various perspectives that poetry creates about the city and the contestations that come out. So I was left a little confused about what exactly was the thesis in this thesis, because there were a number of good arguments that were being made, and I was trying to follow through all these arguments, and that's why I needed a clarity of mind about what exactly was the thesis of your thesis.
The general thesis of my thesis is that the city over the time has changed, and poetry has shown that the city is not a coherent space.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. I'm going back still on this introduction, because that is an area that one meets first when they really interact with your thesis. You do a very good job of acknowledging earlier poets, most of those ones who were in the magazines, the foundational magazines, and you state clearly that these magazines, this were the Pen Point, the Dana, were the first spaces in which African or Ugandans were given chance to publish poetry. And I want to thank you for that. Now, the ontological argument for using these anthologies using these magazines as anthologies. You say that these magazines could be seen as anthologies. And the question I have to ask, if these magazines, if these poems were published in various volumes or issues of these magazines, and quite often people publish or write poetry in these magazines not because there's a particular thematic trend. People write these poems on any issue that they have. Now the question, how can these poems, these magazines be seen as anthologies, because they have been published over a number of years in these magazines. In what way do these magazines constitute anthology?
Thank you very much, Doctor. Anthologies, like I stated clearly, anthologies bring together collection of voices. And ideally, anthologies are meant to be, constructed in terms of thematic, genres, or time. But in as far as Ugandan literary landscape is concerned, the literary products first appeared in literary magazines that did not have specific criteria such as the thematic concerned or the genre. So you find that in a given literary magazine, say in Penpoint, there are a number of genres included in those publications, including book chapters. Part of somebody's novel maybe can be put there, poetry, even non-literary materials were put there. But given my interest in beginning to read the urban life, beginning from the 1960s, there were no book anthologies then. So because literary magazines draw together these multiple voices, I thought I could solicit some of the poems from there. So you'll find that in a publication, maybe I can get 2 poems speaking about urban life. That is how I considered literary magazines to be part of anthologies, because they draw together this collection of voices, okay? And then this space encourages, convergences and contestations. So I thought choosing poems from there could benefit, and indeed, since they were the only available, material in the 1960s through to 70s and 90s, I thought those could be my basis. And indeed, they behave very much the same way like an anthology does. And also, anthologies coming like in the year 2000, okay, partly 90s, the year 2000, for example, Uganda Poetry Anthology 2000. Whereas it is true they were supposed to look at anthologizing based on themes or time or genres, there are collection of, themes put in some of those anthologies. So I just fished out 1 or 2 in them, talking about urban life. So I think it is proper enough for me to consider these literary magazines as part of anthologies because of the ways in which they are constructed.
Yeah, I appreciate your, as I said, as I was beginning this question, that your involvement, your going down to hunt down for these poems, because they give us a lens of how the poets at that time saw the city. But what was intriguing me was, why is this candidate not opening up? Since almost all poems, I'm saying most of the poems are written in anthologies, why aren't you opening up as make it Ugandan poetry? Why do you insist on seeing these magazines as anthologies? I know this has been dealt with some of the scholars around here, but I still have that area intriguing me. But I will rest that case there. In your background to the study, you rightly claim that literary studies on African cities in general concentrate on Lagos, Accra, Abidjan, Nairobi, Kinshasa, and Johannesburg. It's true. What novel reading, my question is, what novel reading of the urban does your thesis add to these studies? Because you mentioned that these studies have been done about these cities. What novel reading of the urban does your thesis add, which hasn't already been done? by these studies that you mentioned? What gaps do these readings leave that your study aims to cover? Because you have mentioned that they concentrate on these cities, and you are right, by the way. They concentrate on these cities. Much writing from South Africa, from Nairobi, from Accra, from Lagos, and etc. So the question I'm asking: what novel reading of the urban does your thesis add to these studies?
What novel reading does my thesis add? First of all, scholars like Sarah Nato, in her work, The Literary Cities, in which she studies a text, Welcome to Hillborough, about Johannesburg. She concentrates in interrogating the city as represented, the crisis of the city, the problem, the challenges from that fictional point of view. My reading does bring a new lens in the literary, from literary perspective. It contributes in the sense that I'm bringing in the rural and the urban together. I'm trying to tease out, construction of how urban is represented, how the rural is represented, how they interact from the point of view of the written poetry. Possibly there are other, studies that have been done, like James Ogude's work on the invention of Luo Night in Nairobi speaks about, how when materials from the rural move into the urban, they earned new audience. That comes from oral texture of the city. But here I'm coming from written poetry. So I bring this conversation, I join this conversation from the written.
Thank you for that question that you have addressed ably. You justify your study, and I want to quote you, page 16. Studying the poetry anthologies contributes to the construction of a framework for engaging with a variety of ideas, emotions, and styles. These are very, very, very informative words, actually. Can you clarify what this framework exactly is and how you have engaged it in your thesis? Because you claim that studying these poetry anthologies contributes to the construction of a framework. So the question that perhaps which was intriguing me, what kind of framework is the candidate constructing? And if she has constructed this framework, how has she used this framework in her thesis?
Poetry anthologies indeed provide us with new lens of reading the city from the point of view of the collective. The fact that poetry anthologies present collection of voices, it creates this, this idea of the city not being studied from one lens, but from a collection of voices. And somewhere I argued that poetry anthologies, which draw together multiple voices, is best suited for a multidimensional space such as the urban, described as, an agglomeration. So I thought, looking at the urban from these multiple voices is justifiable enough for me to say this is really the point of view I'm joining the conversation.
Yeah, because there have been previously frameworks like Walking the City, where people view, some person walks and we see perspectives of the city through one individual's point of view. A good example is Teju Cole's Open City, and the flaneur, the framework. So how can we call this Lakot framework of reading the city? And how has this framework been engaged? Because yes, poetry provides that lens, but what can you clarify that particular lens? Because when I talk about a lens of walking the city, it's very clear that someone walks the city, and through this person's perspectives, we are seeing the various aspects about the city. So can you help me understand this Lakot framework?
Thank you, Doctor. The framework drawing from the archive of the anthology, to me, is the fact that I study the city based on the collective voicing. The specific framework, like walking the city, which I also engaged with, because there are poems that do speak about walking the city, and I pay attention to them. And then there are also ideas that the city should be looked at as text. I do pay attention to that, but because the poems already provide for me the lens, I simply focus on the collective voicing to look at the city. So I have little idea whether to call that Lakot.
Okay, candidate Lakot for that question.
Lakot. Thank you.
And I want to thank you for your courage in answering that question. You use, actually, the theories that you use are really appropriate for your work, and you knew your theories well. And I would like to ask you, what intrigued me is, how do these three theories relate? How do they relate? And why the three theories? Because we need to, was it that convenience that in each chapter this theory is working here, is working there, is working there? How do they relate? How do they support each other in your work?
I do use three different theories. First is the theory of planetary urbanism that views the city as a fabric that stretches and envelopes everywhere. This theory, I saw that with the metaphors that the scholars do provide, that is focusing on the repetitive and then focusing on the city as a place of intermingling. I saw that these were good tenets for me to engage with the everyday that I do analyze in the first objective. And then I do talk about the idea of, rural-urban connection using that lens. This theory is not sufficient enough to address the notion of self and community that I was interested in, and also it emerges clearly in the readings of the poem. Because then I would just stop by looking at the urban life, the everyday, and do not cast light on what is the nature of life of individual and how do they negotiate their spaces within the communities they exist. So I do introduce this theory for augmenting the first. I do introduce the theory of self to augment the idea of the planetary urbanism. And then, while thinking about the different development that has taken place from the 1960s through to 2020, I thought I should pay attention to the fact that there is so much relationship between literature and history, which I bring in chapter 5 of my work. So these theories augment each other. They fill the gap where urban theory is not sufficient, these two have come and filled the void. Yeah, so I thought they can blend together.
Yeah, and from your explanation, I can see that. From the reading, though, it needed to be written in that expression needed to be written within the thesis, so that you prevent yourself from questions of being accused of theoretical tourism in your work.
Noted.
Thank you. In your theoretical framework, you acknowledge the pitfalls of global urban theory, and I want to quote theorists like Kamarov, and Kamarov see the Euro-American claim for universal as erroneous because they believe such a theory designed in the North emphasizes the idea of global cities and ignores the South. If you agree with Kamarov and Kamarov, how do you then justify your use of planetary theory instead of foregrounding much of your work in African urban theory, which is more attuned with the African urban experience? Because planetary urbanism has the danger of flattening local differences. So how do you address the danger of applying it in your reading of Ugandan poetry?
Thank you, Doctor, for the question. I do frame my theoretical framework beginning by highlighting what scholars think about urban and how African urbanities should be read. I acknowledge the fact that Kamarov and Kamarov do criticize the Eurocentric theories. And I also acknowledge that within the post-colonial theory, a new dimension is introduced, the fact that cities should be studied as ordinary based on their distinctive, features. But I make my selection of the planetary theory because my thinking was that I cannot run away from this Eurocentric, premise, because it does provide for me something to use. And this is a theory that, of course, has received criticism. But the fact that they think about the urban space as a fabric stretching outwards, I thought it was a good thing. Within African scholarship, Atto Quayson, the scholar who studied Accra, the Oxford Street, does acknowledge the fact that in the city or in the street of Accra, there is constant interaction of the local, global, the rural coming to the urban space or to the city. Since Atto Quayson, a seminal fellow, do that, I thought I can borrow from him the way he studied the Oxford Street, which were similar to what I engaged with in Ugandan, the street that I engaged with in the context. So using planetary urbanism does not really cause any harm in my reading, I think.
Yeah, you had safeguards. That's, in other words, you had safeguards in your reading of that theory.
Thank you. Thank you so
much. Okay. As I say that your literature review was very comprehensive, and it showed that you had really done your work. Now, after reading all these scholars, where are the points of agreement? Where are the points of divergences among these scholars? I felt that that you were saying what gaps, what you want to do as a scholar, and you really did it very well. I would say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do... You promise a lot in that review. But in terms of seeing how these scholars contradict one another or speak to themselves, you're a little conspicuous about these things, these conversations. Why being conspicuous about this?
In my literature review, I acknowledge the fact that scholars do think about African cities differently. Scholars have viewed the African city as characterized by crisis, and there has been counter scholarship to that effect, that the African city shouldn't be looked at from that perspective, that the African city is full of crisis and that the rural is savage. No. We should concentrate on the potential the African city gives. And indeed, from popular perspective, I engage scholars like Corinne Baba, who highlight how, people within the city have, even the disadvantaged, are very resourceful. This conversation goes on, and there are different, ideas about what African city is and what, they promise. But I come to this conversation from a poetic lens, a lens that has not been, sufficiently represented in the urban conversation. This is where I come from as such, from this perspective of the poems.
More so from the Ugandan poetry perspective, because you may find that there are conversations about poetry and the city in the Euro-modern world. Thank you for that question. You state you use 70 poems in your work, and you give reason for that. How did you come up with that number 70? How did you come up with that figure of 70 poems? How did you come up with that figure of the 70 poems? What led you to believe that 70 poems are sufficient for your work? Why not 2, 3, 10, 100, 1,000? Why the 70? Was it biblical reason that we live up to, the man shouldn't exceed 70 years? What was the reason?
Thank you, Doctor. I should say, with all honesty, that what led to the 70 poems was the fact that I had it all in front of me. I had more, actually. But because some of the sections, especially some objectives, were, the poems that I pick on were kind of now speaking the same thing. I would say I'd reached a level of saturation. I left the others. Then I continued. What guided this 70, it is not really watertight that I should come up with 70 or 5. But what was available and that which I saw could be representative and engaging enough for me to speak about urban life through this poetic lens. So the number 70 is not biblical, but if it is by coincidence, then it is a nice coincidence.
Okay, thank you for answering that question. I know I'm taking a lot of time here, but I would like to ask you, if you just in just 2 sentences maybe, what is your main finding? In just 2 sentences, what is your main finding? Is your main finding, what is your main finding? Just in 2 sentences, that's briefly.
My main finding is that the urban is porous, is fluid, but at the same time, there are ambivalences within the urban space.
And to you, this finding has not been kind of dealt with in previous scholarship. Do you think previous scholarship has not seen the city as porous or ambivalent, for that matter?
Previous scholarship, like the seminal theories that are used at Thrift and then Emin, do acknowledge that the urban is porous. But what my study bring in the plate here is that whereas the urban is perceived of as porous, there are subtle disconnection and subtle restriction. And I argue, especially under Objective 3, that as far as social life within the urban space is concerned, there are tight restriction, which is not spoken about. But you find yourself going to where you belong. There is a poem titled La Roque from Napak. La Roque is the persona. He comes all the way from Napak. The reason was that he wants to make his family rich. If the region doesn't want to be rich, he is determined. But where does this young, boy settle? When he comes, he settles where his friends are, in Kisenyi. And then comes to the urban street to beg money. Something which is really very kind of not really meeting to his own obligation. So La Roque does not come and go to live in Kololo. Okay? So there is this subtle restriction that is not paid attention to. Whereas the urban is porous, it has also evolved with time. This porousness can be questioned, and this is exactly what I do under my Objective 3.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for answering that question. And as I wind up, I have a question. This chapter 5 that you wrote so beautifully, what would happen if it was put before? Because this is where I was seeing the changing perceptions of the city, and I was saying, wow, I wish this was given to us. Because initially we see the city in newer anthologies, and in that chapter 5 you give us this the changing perceptions of Kampala. You may need to answer, you may not need to answer, depending on whether that is the way you thought it would better be presented. But I thought when I was reading that this beginning part was giving us one or the other a kind of background to your work. Do you wish to say something about that?
Yes. Yeah, I thought at the beginning when I was framing the work that I could begin to trace the changing patterns, but I thought to myself again, before you begin to trace the changes, why don't you first get to know what the urban space looks like, and then later you can interrogate the patterns of growth. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very logical reason to give. And normally, I know I want to ask this question. If you are told to rewrite this thesis again, what would you change in this thesis? Or what would you strengthen in this thesis?
If I'm given the opportunity to rewrite this thesis, of course not for the correction, for submitting in the library, I was going to focus on the gender narrative.
Thank you very much, candidate Lakot, and I thank the Dean and the doctoral team for making this activity possible. I wish you all the best the rest of your scholarly journey.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Musanje, for that beautiful interaction with the candidate. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to recognize the presence of Professor Edith Natukunda. Yes, I now call upon Professor Navutanyi to come and interact with the candidate.
I prefer to stand since my teachers are
Thank you, Dean Sauda. Thank you, the guy from the other place on Ginger Road. And thank you, Sophie and your team for work well done. We'll start with the positive, and I find your textual analysis of Ugandan poetry exemplary, well done. And for that reason alone, you should be given your damned thing. There's a way this National Council kind of messed this process because I know you know some of the things I'm going to talk about and you are prepared for them. But two, the independent reader has, you know, done an excellent job, that it will be nitpicking and, you know, looking for relevance for me to say anything substantial after his. But I will start with the third question. And this is chapter 5, your chapter 5. My own reading is that your work is good, but this was perhaps the best, the best part of your work. And I'm talking from hindsight, reading what you had gone through, what your team went through, the different questions this might have asked, but this was really good work. And I also wish that it would have framed the rest of the thesis, the changing image of Kampala. If you are reading the representation of Kampala in poetry from the 60s to the 2000s, then you need that frame. Has Kampala been the same? Has it changed? And if it has changed, how has it changed? And how have these changes affected or influenced or aided or supplemented how Ugandan poets or poets generally refer to it? Then the other, what I call the missed opportunity, was in your statement of the problem, and I will go to that line. You say in the fourth line, you claim that, let me get it. You state that that your problem is to study how Ugandan written poetry imagines the city in terms of context, space-time as chronicled in Ugandan, anthologies from the 1960s to the 2020s. I say that while this is an ideal and researchable topic for a literary project, they claim that she is doing so because of the intersection between the urban and poetry is justification enough. But what is the lost opportunity, and this is you talking, since poetry deals with emotions, the study of how poetry projects and imagines the city focuses attention on the human needs, the interrelationships, the dynamics, the service related issues with the urban and the process of change, especially in Uganda. And somehow this stayed here. The analysis is important, but you don't come back to this idea of how an emotion focused genre, what insights. If you are talking about, say, the area where if you are talking, for example, unemployment or gender exploitation, how does an emotion based genre do this? That, say, fiction or prose does not do, or what drama can't do. I thought that was an missed opportunity in this, but something that you can come back to later on. Now, specifically, I want to take you to your methodology, because these are some of the careless things that make exceptionally good work look sloppy. One, what is your understanding of survey? Is it a method? Is it a data collection tool? In your research?
My understanding of survey is, in the way I carry out my reading, first I carry out a preliminary reading to source for the anthologies. So I call that as a survey. First I go to see the possibility and what is there that is available for me to use. Perhaps if it is phrasing, which is giving me the challenge, I'm open to, making reflection.
Okay.
But I understood it as a way of, sourcing for materials that I could engage with at a later time.
Then two, you state in 1.10.2 that the secondary data is in Makerere University Library. What do you mean?
Oh, okay. The secondary data. Okay. Here, perhaps I have even changed that already. But what I meant was the fact that I do identify these literary magazines from the library. I think that has changed now in the book.
Okay. Next, you had a very lively discussion with the independent reader on the anthologies.
Yes.
So my simple question is, how many anthologies
did
you study?
I engaged with 7 book anthologies. And then I identified 2 literary magazines, Penpoint and Dana magazines. And then I also solicit 1 online literary anthologies, poetry anthologies, that I do explain and why I include it here.
Then you would agree with me that the way you frame your title and the introduction have to change. Because for me, I read only 2 anthologies, technically.
Okay.
There is the Uganda Poetry Anthology 2000 and the Border Anthology. Those are the technical anthologies.
Okay.
Perhaps this is to emphasize the independent readers probably point that maybe tying yourself to a technical term might not be useful, but opening this might give you the leeway or the area within which to work.
I take note of that.
Now, chapter 2 is Urban Dynamics, Context and Identities in Ugandan Poetry. And this is a question, and I just want to have your sense of this. Of the 4 core chapters, you read 70 poems. Again, I had the question, why 70? Why not more than 70? But I want to take it even further than the general 70. In chapter 2, you focus on 24 poems.
Yes.
In chapter 3, you focus on 18. In chapter 4, 9, 24, 18, 9,
and 24.
And 24. Why? What is the logic?
The logic behind 24, 18, 9, and 24 is that my selection relied on the objective. So I solicited only poems that speak to particular objective. So 9 in under objective 3, those were the seminal poems I could use. There were others, all right, but they do not give me that rural urban feel in both. There were others, certainly, but I had to weave them out. There is no particular, interest in having to favor the other chapter and, give little for the other, but it was based on what was available in terms of the poetry I had in my hands. 24 poems, I had actually more poems for the first objective. But because the poems were simply now giving me the same ideas, like I can say that it had reached a saturation method point, I could leave the others out. That was the reason, but I'm open to further, thinking together with some guidance.
Okay. The reason I ask this is that the thesis must look like a thesis,
okay,
and therefore it must have structure and symmetry.
Okay.
You must create a pattern.
All right.
And if it is 24, then it should be 24 across or
Okay.
9 across, because then you create a pattern.
Okay.
But it also that lack of symmetry and pattern also went further even into the analysis.
Okay.
Now your chapter 2 is 45 pages. And of those 45 pages, pages 36 to 81 focuses on one sub-theme, and 11 pages, the close reading of poems about the street run from page 36 to 81, and then the analysis of the market and the taxi park and the residential area runs from for only 11 pages. 45 pages for the street, 11 pages for 4 other sub-themes. Care to explain why?
Again, it might appear like I was favoring the other chapters or section. But again here, the thing here was that while I engaged with the street, first I note that these contexts that have emerged from the poems are actually noodle points. They are the points through which multiple, issues come up. And so, when I started off with the street context, there were numerous poems offering diverse issues. By the time I got to Taxi Park, I mean the market first, some of the issues that emerged under the context of the market were already in the street context. And the same for the taxi park. So I discussed them, but other eyes saw that I could leave them out without causing any harm. So the irregularity perhaps is because I had already reached some point where I could not repeat the discussion anymore. But I am open to, looking through it again, and I thank you for pointing out this. I take note of that.
Okay, point noted, but the point I wanted to draw your attention to is that you are showing that the street is important, and it is a recurrent motif in Ugandan poetry, which it is.
Okay.
And perhaps this is going forward, this is where you could do a chapter or an article on the representation of the street as an important metaphor, as an important, and Madam Dean, I don't know how I'm doing for time. I might just start enjoying myself. In chapter 3, the same question comes up.
Yes.
And I don't know, 18 poems. And you seem to concentrate. You seem to concentrate on poems written in the 60s and 70s, especially when you are addressing the issue of prostitution.
Yes.
Does it mean prostitution was a 1960 issue? We don't have prostitution now. I mean, I don't know. It is a serious point, and sometimes you need to give your readers clues.
Okay.
And even pointing out that in the poem, within this period, this was the most popular thing, is important. But care to reflect on that?
Thank you. I do acknowledge that I do not give a signpost to that effect, but poems of the 1970s and 60s, this is the post-independent period, and the theme of prostitution comes out very prominently. But I didn't really want to go, I did not like to go that direction of post-colonial theory. So I restricted myself here, but going forward, I'm going to try to do this signposting and make it clear. And thank you for pointing out
I
that.
did mention that chapter 5 was a very good chapter, but I also needed to point out, and you don't have to respond to this,
Okay.
but it was written in a hurry.
Okay.
It was like, I'm done with it. the damned thing. Because even there are like only 2 sections, and you are rushing through them, and there are very many topographical errors that you need to address. Now I have maybe in 3 minutes. Let's go to the literature review. Again, I have no reason to object to the literature is done very well, but there are gaps. I appreciate that Quayson's Oxford Street is very important, and you mention it, but you don't give it the attention it deserves. I think in my reading of your thesis, you mention or you refer to him 4 or 5 times. But I thought he was very important. Then there are some other careless, but I wanted to know, I thought it was careless. You talk of Joyce Carey, who writes Heart of Darkness.
That was just a miss. I've corrected already.
Okay.
I acknowledge that the gap. I corrected it.
But I thought that you can't talk about the African city, which Kampala is and is not. And that is another issue. Are you writing about Uganda urban poetry, or are you writing about representation of Kampala in Ugandan poetry? That has to be made, because it, what you are calling it and what it is, there's a tension there. You need to address that. But the point is that you can't write about the African city without, you know, gesturing to Franz Fanon, without gesturing to Ogude, Membe, and not just mentioning them, but engaging with their work substantially. Now, how many theoretical frameworks, how many theoretical approaches guided your work?
There are 3 main theoretical lines that I engaged with.
Okay. But you stated that there are 2 in that section, and then casually on page 29 you introduce as a new theory. Go back to that.
Yeah, sure. I do acknowledge. But when I got the...
you preface your thesis by drawing a statement from Walter Benjamin,
Yes.
Who is the father of the urban subjectivity.
Yes.
I thought that he would appear again. Why did you use him and then ignore him? And that is my last question. Second last question.
I draw from Walter Benjamin's One-Way Street, that quote, in line with how anthologies come together. And I choose particularly from a review by Susan Sontong, who gives a review of Walter Benjamin's One-Way Street. So that quote comes from Susan Sontong, but it is in that book. However, I do acknowledge Walter Benjamin's, idea of the city be looked at as text. I do not engage with him because there were other scholars like Henry Liverbo and then Edward Sonja, who speak eloquently about the idea of space that I do engage with in chapter 2. And so, like for Walter Benjamin, who focuses on ideas of urban cities as text, from a cultural perspective, I think I can only return to him for future engagement.
Okay.
That is why you see him only once there.
Because
and then the rest.
everyone else you are referring to actually owes lineage and descent from his postmodernism understanding of the city. And this is a comment
Okay.
that maybe during your revision and going forward,
Okay.
be mindful of citation.
Okay.
Because they are kind of...
I acknowledge that gap.
I don't want to use the word I would have liked to use, but these are the short-hanging fruits which you have to address so that people engaging with you will engage with you on substantial issues than questioning if you have cited this Lakot 2025 properly.
Okay.
And if you have two Lakots, how do we distinguish Lakot Lakot GLC and Lakot social dynamics? But like I said at the start, me, I was just nitpicking, you ignore me graciously,
No,
and that you get your thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Point noted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nabutanye. I call upon Dr. Isaac Tibasima to interact with the candidate. 2 minutes. Not mean, they are killing my girl.
You will get your thing, Wama. They said that's the same to all of us. Congratulations, Sophie, upon getting this far. And while Professor Nabutanye loved your chapter 5, I enjoyed your chapter 4, interestingly. And I liked it, and I would like to start from there. I liked it because of something you've said about the fluidity of the city, yeah? And the rural-urban interaction that points to this fluidity. But also, I thought about it as something that could point to how we also experience reality in our daily life, okay? So, my question about this is, how do these poems sometimes blur the lines between the rural and the urban, but also sometimes create very thick lines between these two spaces?
The poems that I engage with clearly demonstrate that the urban is both fluid and restricted. How do they show this blurring and thickening? Through social interaction within the urban space. The poets demonstrate that while we think of the urban space as open and we can enter in terms of spatial boundary, inside there are subtle restrictions. And then through ideas such as, emanating from cultural practices and other obligations, and even pointing out notions of, conflict. Poets demonstrate, for example, that both spaces do experience conflict. I give an example, again, of the poem Larok from Napak. Larok from Napak leaves his village because in the village there is hunger, problem of food and so on. And then while he is in town here, he experiences challenges with, interacting. So this is no longer thinking of the urban and the rural as a binary, because the poems have demonstrated that there are conflicts in both spaces. So this makes it blurred. And also, like I point out, one of the things that encourages this blurring of the rural-urban is transport network that keeps back and forth. Ideas keep moving here and there. So that is how the poems that I engage with show.
In essence, you can experience urbanity in the rural and experience the rustic in the urban. Mm-hmm. I would be happy if that could be strengthened in your work, okay? Because you show it, you talk about it here, but in your work, while these interactions are talked about, you're not, and here I'm thinking about also how we think about modernity, and how modernity can be experienced even in the so-called unmodernity. That's something you want to think about.
Second note.
The other thing I would like you to think about is how and this for me is really important. Cities can be both spaces but also characters. Okay?
Okay.
And I would like to ask in what ways you see them become, the cities especially, how they become active participants in the lives of the people who occupy them. And here I'm thinking about, I know that this goes into oral poetry, but how we think about oral poetry and music as part of our everyday life, okay? And I think what Agau calls African rhythm, that from the day we are born to the day we die, there is always a celebration that's creative around us. But also there are spaces that we all occupy as part of either the city or the rural. And I'm thinking, if the city becomes a personality or a character and moves beyond its speciality, how does this city as an active participant then work in the lives of the people who occupy them, especially in the poetry that you work on? I don't know if I'm clear.
Thank you. The city influence the ways in which we carry ourselves. It also shapes our identity when it becomes like an active agent, like you said, based on the circumstances and the context in which individuals operate within the urban space. The city does label them in some ways. Look, for example, this poem that I read for you, the portrait. The man that sits with the broom on the one hand, he waits for sweeping at 2 o'clock. This man is conditioned and positioned because of what he is within this urban context. While he is coming to look for labor in the urban space, this is the only thing it can do. This is what the city can afford for him, for that matter.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
2 things, and this is just to help you improve. No, maybe 3 things. When you talk of survey, and I think I understand where Dr. Nabutanye is coming from. Survey is a very quantitative thing. Please be careful about these words. Survey is too quantitative. So what if you really say that you do a review of documents and literature on the things that you're dealing with, so that then you can get it strongly explained in your methodology. The other trouble I had with your work is you tell us about studies talking about Lagos, Accra, Abidjan, and Kinshasa, but you seem to ignore the fact that the East African city has also been talked about. And I think I've told you about Ombongi. Ombongi's work is really good on this, and Mukoma Wangugi. I would be glad if, and I think I've said it before, I'd be glad if we could also see a way in which East African cities have been talked about. I'm aware of Dar es Salaam, I'm also aware of Nairobi, and there's a lot of work on these 2 cities,
Yes.
okay? Including the best one I love about Nairobi being a tot of whiskey. Okay? And it's one of the most beautiful pieces I've read on Nairobi, but also Mukoma's Nairobi Heat would be a nice thing to read. And I think I've also always pointed you to David Kerr's work on Dar es Salaam. If you could move beyond the African cities, and I know that you talk about Primorak's work, and then come down to the East African cities and what people have said about them before you come down to Kampala. My trouble, and I think the opponent said it and Dr. Nabutanye has said it, is your awareness of the fact that urbanity is not just Kampala is a bit problematic. So it would be good to say that in your thinking of urban, you're thinking of Kampala. But you also show us your awareness that urbanity has seemingly become a very interesting thing in this country. Okay? Please don't say interesting thing in this country, but we know. We know that urbanity in this country has evolved over time.
Yes.
So you have all these cities that have come up, and some of them are really terrible cities if you've been to some of them. I've always told people, for me, the only city that is close to Kampala is Gulu, in my opinion. In my
Thank you.
opinion, please. The others, I am not sure about them as cities. And maybe, and maybe, Dean, I plead the fifth about Masaka. And then the other thing about your theories, I think, I don't know why you said 3 theories, because like Ian, your work actually talks of planetary urbanities and new historicism. And probably one of the things you want to do is to tell us what each of these theories brings to the table in your argument. To say, okay, planetary urbanities does this and this and the other, but is not able to show us how the city has evolved. So that which helps me to show how the city has evolved is the new historicism. And why? Because new historicism sees history as text. And because these two things are speaking to each other, then you can bring the idea of poetry and say, well, poetry is text, it's drawing on historical realities. Okay? It is exploring the idea of the city, but it's also showing us how this city is growing over time. So be clear to say, this is what I'm dealing with in new historicism, this is what I'm dealing with in planetary urbanities. But this is what this theory does not do that the other theory will do. Okay? And then find a kind of synergy between your cities. The one thing I enjoyed also with your work, and I think this is why I have issues with many people's work, is you very well show us how methodology and theory interact. I found that beautifully done. Because I see many students struggle with that. But you ably tell us how you are doing your analysis and how you're drawing on theory, how you do your collection and how you again draw on theory. So those are things that I'm really happy about in your work. So maybe my last question. What's the significance of these new identity markers that you talk about, especially the identity markers of the city, but also of the urban in Ugandan poetry?
The new identity markers that I point out from the reading is border, and then Rolex. And I state that they have become new identity markers of Kampala and also for the general urban life in Uganda. What this means for the urban growth and urban life is that looking at border transport system and who uses it, and then looking at also who are the consumers of Rolex. Although Rolex today have really gone to the supermarket and malls, I still feel that these new identity markers suggest that whereas our cities and urban life is growing in terms of economy and so on, there is commensurate growth between this wealth on the one side and poverty, because many people use border as their preferred transport network, especially in the busy Kampala. And people who cannot afford much, they can manage to get Rolex for 2,000 on the street and eat it. So there is this commensurate growth going on, side by side. This is what I'm talking about, like the city offers both the good and then the challenged. Yeah. So
I also hope you're aware that Rolex is actually a very expensive watch. I hope you're aware of that. I also hope you are aware of how chapati and ginger are connected. I don't know if you know that, but that's the truth. Okay. So these are things that might look very subtle, but also very interesting ways in which we can think about cities. And I think when you talk of borders, you also want to think about how borders have been written about in Lagos and Abuja. Very interesting studies. Actually, even Accra. you'll be very amazed at what they are saying about them. But also for me, why Rolex was interesting is also how we think about street food. You see, I don't eat street food, so I struggle with this. But I find the whole idea of Rolex interesting because it also shows, like you say, a lot about the inequalities that exist. And I think this is something beautiful in the way you present it. So thank you, and looking forward to welcoming you to the other side of the river.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Tiwasima. I would like now to call upon, I will save the giants for last. Dr. Ivna, not in our time. Pardon?
Thank you very much, Chair, and congratulations, Sophie. Already, anyway. Congratulations upon reaching this milestone, and congratulations to your midwife, and what is the other one? Okay. Mid-husband? No.
Thank you.
Yes, Sophie, I found this was a really novel kind of research. I love the way you moved out, away from the common topics and then looked at urbanity and then looked at poetry and how it creates the urban. And I found that really interesting. And then when I looked at your title and when you foregrounded new historicism, I kept on waiting for your engagement with the change. And though I agree with Dr. Nabtanyi that yes, chapter 5 could actually become the whole of course in another world now, because this is, but yes, but you could actually, that's a opportunity that maybe you can work on, maybe in another publication or what, the tracing of this change. Because I saw that your identity markers were also changing in each generation and in each time period, and that talks a lot. Anyway, now that leads me to one. Anyway, few questions. One, well, you assumed we can just understand urbanity, the term urbanity, but well, I'm one of those few ones who really take long to understand, and I did not even understand because now, okay, now you defined the urban on page 11, and then, but urbanity you never decided, so you left it to us to guess the kinds of things we mean by urbanity, and then you now went, you used the term, and you went to literally urbanity on page 16, said, okay, now this is growing. I waited for the definition you forgot, so could you? Literally urbanity, for instance.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Urbanity refers to urban way of life. And I do point out that the urban does not have a watertight definition. Depending on where you stand or the discipline, one can describe urban based on their discipline. But in this study, the urban space is the creative space that I engage with. Yes, so urbanity is a way of urban life.
Okay, and literally urbanity therefore is literally way of
is the way in which urban life is represented.
Okay, but I think, but you use it as a technical term, so I think you really need to think clearly about what you went, and in the context on page 16, it doesn't mean what you've told me now. So you need to go back there and fix that. Okay, so now one of your objectives was to analyze the portrayal of changing urban realities, and you say it goes on to changing. Anyway, changing urban realities of Uganda in the selected poems. And you said Uganda. I said, okay, wait a minute. I hear Uganda, I hear Kampala. So therefore, I was wondering if the Uganda one, is the Uganda created in the poems equivalent to the Uganda we live in? Because that's your objective, the way you framed it, lived that one gray zone. And then you said Uganda, but then now you focused on Kampala. So is Kampala the same as Uganda, or at least in the world of the poems, or in the actual world? That one don't respond right now, because it might be related to what other things I'm going to ask. So you respond later when I've finished. Anyway, so now those gray zones need to be maybe clarified. And that also made me question, in the imaging of Kampala or Uganda or the urban, yes, how have you dealt with the controversies around referentiality? Because I saw that you at one time you were assuming Uganda, the Uganda we live in, where we're standing, in which we live now, is the same as the Uganda that you find in the poems. So then I was asking, how do you then deal with controversies of referentiality, the way literature mediates reality? That one you will also answer later, maybe. Okay. Yeah, maybe first answer those ones because they are related, then we can move.
How do I distinguish the Uganda that poetry depicts and then from the Uganda we live in? Poetry represents, whereas urban scholars, other urban scholars do concentrate on challenges facing urbanity, literary scholars, now I'm talking from the point of view of poetry, it represents those things that could mirror the actual Ugandan urbanity.
I'm not convinced, but we'll go. Now, what aspects of identity do you find significant in the context of the urban that you talk about? And then, relatedly, what do you really mean by urban dynamics? And what are those the ones that you actually want to focus on?
The urban dynamics here, I refer to the different ways in which people negotiate and navigate spaces, and perhaps to point out things that change. Dynamism means the space is, protean and so on. But here I focus on the ways in which people navigate the spaces. And
okay, but when it appears quite a lot significant in your problem statement, then you need to think about particular dynamics that you think you want to focus on, and then how these talk back into your theory, and how and now we are going to find them in your conclusion, but we never do find them. You don't conclude about these dynamics.
Okay.
And neither do you conclude about the identities. And the identity markers. Well, you attempt to interpret the identity markers, but somehow there's something more you could tease out. You could squeeze some more juice from these identity markers and how they image the city that you talk about. But anyway,
I'll take note of that.
Okay, thank you. They gave me 2 minutes, so I'm running about. Anyway, having analyzed the representations of the urban in Ugandan poetry, what emerging insights do you think are relevant to the work of Kampala Capital City Authority today?
Emerging ideas that can be relevant to Kampala City Authority today is the fact that I point out how the informal category of the people seem to really outcompete the city regulatory body in significant ways. For example, the poems that I engaged with under Objective 1 show that whereas they acknowledge the formal authority that are present within the urban space, they significantly show that these authorities are outcompeted. Instead, they invest the powers on the likes of street children, street vendors, and border, who significantly set the pace and the rhythm of the city. So KCCA, Kampala State Authority, should think about these identity markers that I point out, like border, to think through the working of this transport system that is so dominant and overwhelming in the urban space.
Yeah, I find that that area is very interesting. That area is very interesting, and there's a little more that you could maybe stress in your conclusions. Also, because if you were tracing the development and the change, as you keep on talking about dynamics and change, and so there's some more insight that you have not talked about, maybe that was always on the verge of being pronounced and was never articulated, that you might want to pull out, so that something really significant comes out, of your research. Yeah, of course, in addition to what you've already articulated. Yeah, colleagues have talked about theory, but well, you said 3 theories, but I didn't think you needed all of that, because actually new historism was going to serve your purposes in all intents. Okay. But anyway, that one you will discuss with your midwife. Thank you very much. Congratulations. I enjoyed you reading your work, and also I found it really creative and novel. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. If I now call upon Cindy to interact with the candidate. 1.5 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, Chair. Congratulations, Sophie. I thought the Chair would forget and call me last, then I say the professors have said it all. Yeah, I can just congratulate you, but really in the spirit of what Ian said, for me to get relevance, really, I would have to nitpick to get a question to you. Most of it was addressed by the excellent opponent and all the professors here, especially also examiners. So, in the spirit of really looking for it, congratulations once again. Your work was a breath of fresh air. Actually had not really thought about the intense studies that have been taking place in regards how the creatives represent our cities, and I was more intrigued by the work from Kinshasa. But reading through your work, because I somehow pay attention to little details, which are also very necessary, especially in the genre or in the conventions of academia and the journey you've decided to take. So what referencing style were you using?
I used MLA referencing style, and I should state here that I have been using EndNote, and the way EndNote does its in-text referencing has gaps, and for that matter, I'd already started, entering the work manually. So I'm moving away from the electronic entry to manual entry. When you do an entry once in MLA, in EndNote, it will bring you the correct entry. But the second time you are citing the same author with a different text, it will bring you in text, name, years, including the title. That is how you saw those inconsistencies. So I am already trying to weave out all those and enter them manually.
I think your answer would interest people who are doing research on AI and its its impact on us and on our work, because I'm sure even when you're doing the manual, it will be so troublesome if you yourself don't know what it is. But even if it were AI, the list of references, the bibliography, AI would know that it's called works cited. Yours is a reference list. It's actually references, which takes you to something else, which takes you to, you know. So I liked the epigraph. And I was actually looking forward to reading more of those epigraphs, considering the impact of an epigraph onto your work, except also how the epigraph is entered is not what it is in any referencing style, leave alone the AI, ML, A1. So on page 49, when you already put a disclaimer regarding your in-text citation, maybe it's also good for you, machine aside, to know what it is. You do in-text citation and you say debug and plisat in 206. So I was wondering if this is in-text citation, is it debug in 206 or just debug 206 in parenthetical brackets? So I was very interested in who they are. And I meet them on page 17. You refer to other urban scholars, and the book is very pronounced because he does a lot of work in Kinshasa. You list names well separated by semicolons. No year of publication, it's just there are these scholars, Debok, Myers, Plisat, and towards the end you list the title of the book of the last scholar. I was wondering whether that was, now I'm understanding it, AI error, or there is an explanation to why in the in-text citation you would put the author's no year, no page number, and only one author has a book, yet the rest all have titles. If it's an error, you can say it's an error, or if you have no answer, you can say...
That is because I had entered him twice. I had entered them twice with different books. I'm taking care of that.
Okay. Now this the book, I don't know. And Marie Francois, I go to your references, which should be cited works, because the reason I got to your references, I found a statement that you said that was very good, that a city cannot simply be defined by its structure, but by the social relations. I was like, wow. And that one looks like a direct, an indirect citation, but there's no page number. So I go to their work to see their work. And when I went to the bibliography, there's only one book, and you mentioned him so many times. In the bibliography, the entry you made, because I used an e-copy, that work does not exist. It starts with ND. I wish I could find where I wrote it. The work does not exist. Yeah, it starts with ND. It's page 272. ND Kinshasa, Tales of the Invisible City, Ludion 2006. So I was wondering, is this a book? Is this a book chapter? And the entry is in quotation mark, which implies it's an article. So I wanted to get it more. Then I did a simple Google search. That title is not there. And there are lots of books by the book. So I just thought to myself, in your revision, not the revision that ITK, was it ITK? No, EN encouraged you for your next book. But the revision for you to submit, you really have to go systematically per entry from the work onto the bibliography, because chapter 2 for me was the one I found interesting. Just starting to read it, in that first paragraph, you could see again it blocks the reader, because you're dealing with I would just borrow this extension, also AI kind of readers, because we are also following a certain set of conventions to read your work. So you had better write your work following those conventions. I wish you all the very best. Congratulations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I take note of all that, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Magara. Sophie, you may sit, because now the giants are about to begin speaking to you. And you've been standing for a long time. Please. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to now invite our Professor Dipio to come and interact with the candidate.
To let Sophie go scotch-free, right? Yes. Thank you, Dean, and I want to thank all of you who have spoken to Sophie's research, very, very strong and innovative research. And I want to thank you, Sophie, for being faithful. If Dean, you can allow me just 1 minute to do this kind of serenade for Sophie. Because coming from where Sophie comes from, she has put a very strong fight to be where she is. And I want to speak in this particular respect as the PI Makerere base of the project that has groomed her in this research that you are applauding. And I'm happy that her colleague is here, is also going to defend very soon. Let me acknowledge Stephen, who is right there. Thank you for the support of this family. Yeah, I think people who online who belong to this African Urbanities and Hinterland research following you should be happy about you having reached this far. I want to also thank my colleagues who have made very great observations for improving this research, and I will not go back to what you have so eloquently said. Most of them are what I have also noted, and I will just mention them for emphasis that what they say is truly true. You need to pay attention to them. And a lot has been said, Sophie, so far about you are privileging the anthology that the person, my own, who has interrogated you here, has pointed to. You have privileged the anthology above, the single authored, collection, and you have convincingly told us why you have done so. But the anthology, the way you have selected your, poems from, truly also presents some challenges, which you are totally silent about. And I wanted to know whether you have experienced challenges in selecting this 70 coming from diverse voices from these different anthologies, which I thought were also many, by the way. Now we are thought they are just 2, okay? Yeah, that is one that you will seek to answer, adding a little on that. And secondly, you have also done a kind of historical, there is a bit of the historical in your research running from 1960 to 2020. And as has already been mentioned, there are shifts that you are supposed to establish. And honestly, colleagues have said this, I want to emphasize that you need to make us feel these shifts as they move from this phase to that, which is still not very, felt, the shifts you talk about across the years. And Ian has said, does it mean there's none of this happening in this phase when you mention it there? So what is shifting because you use that term. Okay? And then I also want to ask about, there are certain words that you love to use, and I think ENM mentioned that, Dr. Nabulia mentioned that, and one of them, of course, is your favorite notions of this and notion of, and you have even given notions of something as one of the theories, but I also felt there are two. The planetary, you explained very, very well, and it sits very well. And then also new historicism for me, like there, and I didn't feel what, Augustine Noyes as putting it there as another theory for me was not quite communicating effectively. So I don't know whether you want to keep it at that, or you could actually use it as ideas that come from other scholars that may be useful for what you are doing, but not necessarily sitting in the category of theories. In that particular regard, I will also really want you to consider Michel Descartes' idea of everyday, especially in his book, The Practice of the Everyday, which the key reader actually made reference to indirectly, because even there he is thinking, he writes about walking the city in a way, and you are dealing with these everyday people. I think it will be very useful. It is a very important theories of the kind of thing you are doing. I think he has a soul for the ordinary people, because he was a Jesuit priest, for those of you who may not know. Okay. I'm not saying because I'm a reverend sister. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And then coming to the things my colleagues have said, Sophie, this is a strong work. You have benefited from a strong group of scholars that you were part of all through these years you were writing it, and you will do them so much, justice and pride if you paid attention to the details. And it is very difficult to pull this good work down just because of all the carelessness that have been mentioned by my colleagues who have come here. And one of them are really the referencing style. I don't believe it's an AI Isusin Magara. It requires you to pay the attention to because to have titles written in text is something that, I don't know which style is. There are so many of these styles coming in their new editions, and since I belong to the other generation, I may not know. Yeah, but I'm going to draw your attention to pay attention. You are a poet, and you are writing as a poet, and you have been groomed by very strong poets. And I want to read for you something from the classics that will help you do this revision thoroughly, because Horace says something about the dangers of finishing. When you are close to the end, you rush. That is what you said, that the last it's rushed, you rush. But he says this: scratch it out, that area, revise, scratch it out, and put the badly turned lines back into the anvil. There are things take back to the anvil to make better, and this is the caution he gives to poor writing, and you shouldn't fall there. It's simply because you have not paid those attention. So you need to remove the flabby lines. These are from him. You need to remove those harsh and awkward phrasings. They are there. And those unpolished sections. And those pretentious and excessive ornaments, which ENM was saying, one of them was, when, those dynamics, what are they? Those notions of what are they exactly? So, and then remove all obscurities and ambiguities, even if you are dealing with the subject that is dealing with ambiguities and obscurities. On the issues of the identity markers, when you do the analysis, I think it's a very important point. ITK brought it and ECM also. And I think one of the things you said about Rolex, as you explained here, is how dynamic this movement is. That Rolex, which is, was, you know, a street food. I was traveling from Masaka the other day, and we stopped over, and Rolex is very expensive even on the street, because those are people now, tourists who go there. So the movement of Rolex from the ones here to the other is another very interesting area for you to pay attention to, because these other people of high class grab this street food and take it there and make it something else. So it's not binary at all. And finally, I want to ask you this question that I'll ask you to answer, that here is a very nice poetry and city research that has been done. And I want you to say something about, again, the relevance of this research. You know, what will you tell the stakeholders about this research that you are marching out of here with their PhD in this research? What value does it add in our times, in the context where poetry is? How will you explain the existence of a research like this and another one similar to it like this to be sponsored by the broad stakeholders that you know when we revise our curriculum we speak to? Thank you. Your response to what you can. The others are mostly comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor DiPio, for the comments and the guidance. I begin with the last one. My comment to my stakeholders, based on what I've done, is that poetry is a worthy and a genre that should be given attention, because it highlights the ways in which people negotiate and carry out their lives. This study contributes to the debate of how people negotiate life within the urban space. And the knowledge of what a city is has been earmarked as one of the most significant things in as far as achieving the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 is concerned. So this study has given the knowledge of how people should carry themselves within the urban space. But most importantly, stakeholders should pay attention to the fact that they are changing, you know, identities coming out today.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to just push it a little. What kind of African cities, because you are dealing with really African cities, and the reality of how you started this discussion, you know, people from village coming and us there, what kind of African cities would you recommend on the basis of this, knowing exactly what is happening in our cities with this category of people you're dealing with on the streets?
While I recommend that there should be an inclusive city that is all-embracing, city that does not create any boundary between the rural and then the urban or its past, I also want to be attentive to the fact that the urban presents, challenges in as far as social life is concerned. Perhaps the urban I envision is that which should collapse these social boundaries.
Okay,
Thank you
very
Sister.
much for bringing soul to the city. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the guidance, Sister.
Thank you very much, Professor DPO. Allow me to recognize the presence of our principal, Professor Helen Kavala. Yeah, with that, I call upon Professor Bass, and I'm giving him 1 minute. Yeah, giants speak for, and I know his questions are always very easy to answer, so 1 minute we shall be done.
Thank you, Madam Dean, ladies and gentlemen. I think the 1 minute I've been given is just enough for me to congratulate Sophie. and like Professor Edgar Nabutanye said, just let her get the damn thing and go. However, just the additional 30 seconds to express my curiosity about a few issues in the work as I read it. First, Sophie, I liked 3 things about your work, and I must point them out in all fairness. One is that I'd not encountered any other diachronic literary urban history for Uganda's, in Uganda's literary studies. And I look forward to this work being improved and published so that it can sit on the bookshelf to enlighten our reading of the urban in Uganda's literary life. Secondly, I think it has a rich primary corpus. You dive deep into archival resources. I'll be returning to this a little later to raise one question of curiosity, but it's well done. And thirdly, I think the work is generally well structured, notwithstanding and without any prejudice to issues raised by Professor Nabutanye on this one, which you should attend to. However, I'd like you to help me understand this a little further. Reference has already been very made to the 70 poems and the criteria for selecting them. And as the comments were being made about this, I was half fearing that somebody was going to preempt what I was preparing to ask you, but since nobody did, I must raise it myself. The criteria for selecting these 70 poems really is something that you set on your own terms, but you need to build it into the work so that we can see it. Okay, don't assume that we shall just accept it as a given. 70, and could have been 90, could have been 30, could have been whatever. So the beauty with the beauty with us working in the liberal arts and dealing with the qualitative, using the qualitative methodology, is that you build, you make your decisions and justify them, and that will be it. But more importantly, I'm curious. You use a lot of work from student anthologies. I wonder whether there's any specific reason for this. I almost felt you sidelining the professional, the more, seasoned poets that were already in existence, some of them. Maybe we can start the conversation from there. What's the secret behind these student anthologies? Are students closer to the world you are talking to? Or were these others, did you feel they had been already studied?
Thank you very much, Prof. The literary magazines that I engaged with, especially those that published in the 60s and 70s, the contributors were students then. But some of them are seminal authors, such as Timothy Wangusa, whose poems I do engage with in the work. I selected those poems that speak to the notion of urban, and perhaps it was only those students who perhaps engaged with the notion of urbanity. So that is why I do engage with them. But for a more contemporary collection, there was one particular collection that focused exclusively on urban Kampala. So I embraced those poems and picked on those that were relevant to the different objectives. That is how you found the students perhaps there. But I do engage with seminal poets too.
Okay, but you said most of them were students. I wonder what your positioning of David Rubadiri is in this quiz, this maze. He's not a student. He's already a seasoned poet. Do you exclude him because of his Malawian origins, even though he deals a lot with the Ugandan subjects?
There's one particular poem that I draw from him because he appeared in that collection. Because he appeared in the collection and the poem also construct, Kampala, I picked it. I think that is in chapter 5. I do engaged with him.
Okay.
Yes.
I find that in your engagement with these poems and the other students, you privilege prostitution above other urban issues. And I thought that with David Rubadiri's Susanna Nightclub and others, you might have found it worthwhile attending to him. And also, if you hadn't privileged prostitution, you would have probably looked at other urban ailments like those in Kampala, Bega, Death at Mulago, and others. Can you say something about the suggestion that you privilege prostitution above other urban concerns?
Absolutely, I do that. I do acknowledge that in some ways, the poems that I engaged with really tend to construct that ideas more. But the thing is that this is one of the representation of a community that emerged from the selection that I had. While I do acknowledge there are poems that speak to, other issues, they were not within the selected anthologies and then the literary magazines that I do engage with.
You see, because of your failure to state clearly a selection criteria, you invite comments from all over the place. This is the problem you create by failing to state clearly a selection criteria. If there was a selection criteria, I would have read this with all this in mind. But now, without a selection criteria stated, I just see, imaging the the urban in Uganda's written poetry, and I deal with anything urban and raise questions, and leads me to ask why those issues that you have privileged are indeed not built into the research questions if they are so central to Kampala's urbanity. But maybe I'll take your answer to that one to suffice. Now, that's a methodological issue that I would like to leave at that. But let me raise another conceptual question. You are applying Western urban theory mainly, and you're applying it to a Ugandan city that is just emerging from a kind of rural setting. I don't know, do you feel comfortable that urban Western theory applies accurately to the urban setting, to the rural urban setting in Kampala? Or are there any disclaimers that you'd like to make in this respect?
Thank you, Prof. The urban theory that I select within planetary urbanism do construct something that is relevant to my reading. Eminent Thrift argues that the urban extends outward in a planetary manner. It reaches elsewhere through corridors of communication and so on. And at the beginning of this presentation, I did point out that while young, I did not recognize that the urban and the rural were interacting in my relations with my kin who were living here. So the fact that Eminent Thrift provides the idea that the urban interacts outside of its confine, and that it also interacts with its past. I saw that the idea of that intermingling resonated with my reading of the rural urban.
But you
that
surely
is why I choose
agree that urbanities differ in character. For example, while Kampala is urban, you still find a few goats roaming the streets and the cows, and which is something that you'd rarely find in Western cities. And the total application of a theory constructed in Western urban soils you would require some disclaimers from your side. Which areas do you think, now thinking about it more deeply, which areas do you think you would require to make some disclaimers?
Because the urban Kampala, for example, has traces of the rural, which I also demonstrate, that there are, the roosters can be heard in the urban space. And this image of the rooster is mingling with the motorcade, okay, in the same space. I saw that as the idea of rural resilience within the urban space.
Exactly, and that's what I meant by when you are using theory. Yes, you embrace it, but you also point out. You engage with it. Point out areas where its applicability will not be total and exceptional. That's what I meant by few disclaimers in this respect.
I did
but
point
I hope
out.
my point is made on that one. Yes, The other question is one that traces the historical development of your subject. How does the metaphorical representation of the street in Kampala, in your poetry, I mean your analysis of Ugandan poetry, differ across the decades? I'm going to cite to you some few examples of the metaphors that you highlight, but if you have a general observation about the differences in the metaphorical representations of the street, the Kampala street. You have poetry of the 60s, you have poetry of the 2020s. Is it the same, or are there significant differences that you want to advise the reader about?
Absolutely. Yes, there are certainly differences. While poems of the 1960s and 70s construct a fairly tightly restricted urban space in terms of how people, relate. A more contemporary poems show fairly fluid and interactive urban space. That's what I can point out for now.
Okay. Now in chapter 3, now first of all let me state, people have stated which chapters they like most. I think somebody liked chapter 5 and chapter 4 for ITK. I find that from my perspective, chapter 3 has the greatest potential. Yes, chapter 3 has a lot of potential, even though that potential needs to be enhanced. The areas where I think it has a lot of potential, its interrogation of notions of the self and communities. I really found that very intriguing, and the way it deals with the imagery and the names and people as symbols. It's quite rich. I read it a second time because of the way it was. I found it intriguing. Now, but in chapter 3, you come to a conclusion that the city promotes individualism. Okay? You remember that one? Yes, and you echo this similar sentiment in the abstract, but I don't find the evidence speaking to that conclusion from the poetry. Can you help highlight that evidence where you can recall? It's a very logical conclusion. But it's not evidence-based as I read your chapter 3, which is a very promising chapter. It's something that can really be, that would make a very strong publication if you, a standalone publication if you developed it.
I do make that assertion that the urban, in some ways, promotes individualism. Using Timothy Wangusa's poem, The Concrete, and then I think Stephen Hall's View from the University Hall. In these two poems, the poets show that while the individuals are very much interested in outward relationship, wanting to relate beyond self, that is, relational self. They find that the space that they occupy restricts them. I give an example of the concrete by Timothy Wangusa. He says, concrete this way, concrete that way, above and below, something like that. Concrete in the staircase. I offer concrete smile to a concrete neighbor, something like that. Something of that kind. So I read this concrete that has surrounded this, the persona from all directions. While he wants to be somebody else, even the people that he attempts to relate with offer concrete smile. Sort of. And he labels them as concrete, and for him he's also offering a concrete smile. So I look at this, that the space in which this person occupies restricts him from his pursuit of the relational self or the communal self. The same applies to Stephen Hall's poem, View from the University Hall. The persona is positioned at the window and he looks at people moving to towns, to wherever. But he can't get out because he's inside the house. Apparently, I conclude that it was the university main hall there. The concrete has restricted him. So I saw this attempt to desire the communal self, and then the space restricting them, and I said that, indeed, this is in some ways promoting individualism. But also later on, when I interact with other more contemporary poems, I do recognize that this portrayal somehow changed. Perhaps in the document that I gave you, I had not revised. But I have taken care of the fact that this individual portrayal that emerges so much in the 1970s changes. And I attribute this construction of a restrictive space due to the socio-economic, time that perhaps influenced the ways in which the poets saw people's relationship.
Okay, may I add to that that you could probably also reread A Negro Laborer in Liverpool, exclude the racial aspects, and you still remain with the bewildered individual surrounded by plenty. This is a chapter that you really will want to look at very closely in view of developing it further for publication. Okay, my second last question. I take note of the Dean's concern about time and the fact that the candidate has been grilled for a long time. Yes, you study urban life in poetry. Are you conscious of urban life elsewhere in literature to be able to make the comparisons? So, one example that immediately comes to mind is Meja Mwangi's going down River Road, or Kill Me Quick for that matter. What is unique? What is unique about poetry that drew your interest to it, as opposed or as different from the other forms of literary expression? Something that makes you think that it is poetry that could best bring out or what you want to say about imaging the urban, as opposed to others who can do a job that is almost as good.
Thank you, Prof. I was drawn to poetry simply because of the intensity with which poetry uses language. Mm-hmm. Poetry thrives at construction of emotion, and the emotion that we find in poetry comes through people's lived experience and people's perception. Poetry compels readers to pay attention to what is going around the persona or the character involved. So I was drawn to poetry because of the ways in which language is used, which I think the others might do it, but not to the level, the intensity with which I can handle a subject using poetry.
Any examples to that effect?
I'm aware that a novel genre take, a wide span of space to develop an issue, but for poetry, a short space, but give it a terse and concentrated, ideas that one can engage with. That is my reason for choosing poetry.
Okay. And lastly, Madam Dean, I want the candidate to reflect, to respond to this question, but it's really a question of reflection, thinking back at what you've been doing. You engaged closely with the archives, and I personally enjoy doing research that involves looking at archived materials. But one thing I know about archival research is that you always encounter surprises. The odd record by somebody which has not come to public attention, the new knowledge about an individual's lifestyle, all kinds of surprises that that come up. It's very rare that you do intense archival research and you don't encounter surprises, things that you were probably not looking for. Out of curiosity, what are the most surprising discoveries that you made in your sojourn in the archives?
In dealing with the anthologies and archive, my surprise has been with the poets. There are several poets who have not made it to, publishing their own collection and so on. But one of the most surprising, but that which I respect and love, is that I found my teacher in the Dana magazine while he was a student here. And I want to say...
Which teacher?
While he was a student here. And I want to say... My teacher.
Uh-huh.
I'm going to mention to you.
Okay.
I found my teacher in a Dana magazine of 1995. Uh-huh. And I was, wow. And he is speaking about Kampala. And I'm so honored to tell you, Professor, that the teacher is here in the room. He came all the way from wherever he taught me, and he's in the room. Uh-huh. If you don't mind, I can show you.
Yes, I don't mind. Interesting. Okay, and I think that is a positive note for me to end, and I thank you very much. I look forward to reading this.
Thank you very much, Professor, and all other panelists for such a wonderful interaction with the student. Allow us to go and have a bottle of water. Oh. You know, I thought we won't have any questions from the public, but Susan is reminding me, in case there is any question, can we have the online audience, please? There isn't any question. Okay, any question for, yes.
Madam Dean, I'm Eric Jemba Rutaya. I teach ethnic dance. I'm so happy to be present when my little sister is doing this great work. My comment is about her motivational statement at the beginning. If you can remember, it enabled us who are not in that discipline of yours to appreciate the process. She said that she narrated on a scenario where people come from town, come to our villages, and they bring to us bread, some stuff, and a lot of things that they take back to the town. That allowed us to follow closely her presentation, and it was so eminent that we could follow because of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. for the comment. Any other question from the public? I can see Mwalimu shaking his head. So we are back. We had opportunity to discuss Sophie's presentation, and according to the panel, they have noted the following: that the candidate is quite knowledgeable about the subject of her dissertation, and they gave you very good. The candidate's presentation skills, they unanimously said very good. The candidate's response to questions, they all agreed it was excellent. Based on that, they unanimously agreed to recommend you to Makerere University for the award of Doctor of Philosophy of Makerere University. Congratulations, Sophie.